Yeah,
Please.
so thank you for the short introduction. Let me just briefly also introduce myself. My name is Darko Grozdanovski. I work as a solutions architect by Mobile Iron. I have a vast amount of experience in Android. I've been doing Android development since the very early days of Android, so 1.6 and onwards. Right now, I work as in the team responsible for talking with partners. So basically, people that are trying to do a deeper integration into EMM and just trying to help them out how to do a better job at it, how to be more successful at deploying their apps into the enterprise. What are we going to talk about? Sorry, the presentation is not. Good. So what's on the agenda today is basically, has anyone here worked with an EMM solution so far? So do you have any experience with that? Okay, good. So we are just going to briefly mention what an EMM is. We are going to talk about what app config is, which is an interesting, quite an interesting topic in this area. And then we are actually going to do some code examples of something called a managed configuration. So how many of you here are developers and trying to build apps? Okay, good. So I'm pretty much going to focus on the developers, right? This is not this is pretty more or less like a technical presentation and trying to get developers to better understand like what is an EMM and how to actually handle situations around that. So let's start with what is an EMM. So basically, I saw that many of you already have some experience with that. So I'm just going to say in the context of what we're going to talk about today, this is kind of the infrastructure on which enterprises develop and manage their mobile devices. So imagine you're a huge enterprise, maybe thousands of devices, right? You need a way to ensure that all these devices can be managed so you can enroll them, install the required applications on those devices, and all those things based on the team you're working with. So, for example, different apps for sales, for management people, for so all kinds of different situations, right? And then you want to actually secure the devices, so you want to ensure that the corporate data stays on the device, and if you, for example, by some chance you lose the device, something happens, right? You want to immediately be able to wipe that data off, so you don't want to lose any of that corporate information and protect the privacy and the data integrity. Going forward and talking a bit about the challenges when trying to deploy your solutions to the enterprise, right? So many of us as developers, we are typically very used to this concept of like we build our apps, we then go to Google Play, we publish them, and pretty much every one of us knows this process and how this process goes. When our apps end up on Google Play, the users just browse for them on the Google Play Store, download them, and just start using them, right? This has been traditionally slightly different in the enterprise world, right? So you cannot. The enterprises are typically a couple of steps behind. So what has been a long kind of ongoing process, and I've had a lot of experiences in this, is that you definitely have to talk with as you build the application, you have the use cases of deploying to different organizations, so you're not directly deploying to the end users most of the time, but you are going through some kind of an organizational process. Basically, you go through the IT admins maybe, so part of the different segments of the organization, right? And at some point, you have to end up your app needs to end up at the employee's hands. Typically, a lot of issues come up when trying to do this. You end up exchanging a lot of emails with the organization, right? Depending on the size of the organization, they might even demand different things from you. And this is like a complicated thing, right? Imagine an organization of 1,000 employees. They would want to have some sort of a branding. We see a lot of organizations actually having their solutions deployed on-prem. So they would probably even require you to change some URLs and tweak some configurations in the application itself. So this would cause actually your process some delays in the deployment, some delays in the development, like headaches for the developers, right? Trying to figure out how to do this effortlessly. And basically, this is kind of the process that we typically encounter. So we go to the organization for the first time, we talk about our application, then they have some sort of a demand, oh, we need to configure this and that. So we go back, we end up creating some sort of a fork of our application, maybe some different build variant, something else that kind of changes the process, and now we have to maintain more than just one maybe code revision. We have to maintain these build versions. So we build a version specifically maybe for them, right? And then we go back and they are deploying it. And this is an ongoing process which actually happens with every update, maybe occasionally. So it requires quite a significant amount of time and effort. So what is the idea behind kind of the modern enterprise deployments, and how this, what's the idea going forward, and what are some of the recommended approaches of solving these issues? Is basically there are two aspects of this. One aspect is something that Google came up with, is basically trying to go back to this process of just developers interacting with Google Play through something called the Managed Google Play Store, and then together with an EMM solution, actually get this going forward and try to kind of separate the responsibilities of what an app developer needs to do and what an actual IT admin needs to do. So the process is going to be modified into something similar to this. So you end up, as a developer, what you really want to do is just focus on your application, develop your application, publish it to the Google Play Store, and basically you don't want to deal with the specifics of the organization afterwards, right? The responsibility of the IT part of the org and developer operations and so on is to actually get this application from Google Play, configure it somehow, and then deploy it to all the users within the organization, manage the user groups, and so on and so forth. Any tweaks to the configuration, they don't need to involve you. They shouldn't involve you as a developer. The idea is that they can handle this process by themselves. So we are going to introduce something. This is a fairly old thing. It's called the AppConfig community. You can find more details on this website. So the idea is a couple of years old. So all the EMM providers came together and formed a community around standardizing specific ways of working within enterprises, right? So this involves a lot of things like standardizing ways to communicate with the platform directly. So the idea was to introduce native APIs, which we are going to talk about today, trying to do stuff without actually every EMM providing maybe some proprietary SDKs that developers need to use, some very EMM specific, like product specific code that you have to figure out and solve. So the idea is that everything you do is based around a standard, everything you do is based around a community, and everything you do works across all the different organizations and EMM vendors you can run into. So what are some of the benefits around, so what do developers get from this? Basically, as I said, this is a very EMM vendor neutral solution. So you develop your application for one EMM, you test it with one, and you can pretty much be sure that it will run across every single organization and every single EMM you encounter during your sales cycles inside the company. So you don't need to use any SDKs. What we're going to talk about today is actually going to use native Android API, so it has nothing to do with importing any sort of SDKs. And there is a very common concept within EMMs. They all kind of introduce some sort of an API wrapper tools to sort of get your applications and modify them without you actually needing to write code, and this kind of becomes this vendor-specific process which everyone is kind of trying to avoid at this point. Why is this good for the enterprises? Because again, they have access to a huge ecosystem of applications and integrations which are pretty much guaranteed to work, right? It's much easier to get users onboarded on this application, so they are optimized for the enterprise. Here is a list of pretty much all the vendors that are right now part of this AppConfig community, and basically here this is a list of all the applications that right now have some sort of integration related to what AppConfig is all about. So you can, this is not even the full list, new apps are getting added every day. This also applies for in-house apps, so if you want to improve things, even if you're building an in-house application for one organization, you can still go to this website and find out how to do that better. So as developers, we always want to jump into code, right? But it's very important to understand that in some cases, you don't need to write any code. The way this is meant to work in most cases is that the EMM would provide integrations with the OS itself, and you would end up just needing to check certain checkboxes to enable or disable certain features and use already existing implementations that the system provides, right? Some common use cases would be kiosk lockdowns. So I've done that in the past. It's kind of a tedious process, right? So you get this out of the box without doing any sort of coding, any sort of implementation. Things like VPNs for connecting to on-premise solutions. So we've handled that as well, trying to figure out how to get to an application to get to our own organization's network from the outside, and a bunch of even smaller stuff like disabling copy-paste screen captures and a lot of other things. So the point here is that you have to actually, the best thing to do is actually first go into the organization, figure out what EMM system they're using, and try to figure out what options you can use to basically speed up your development to optimize your application without even writing any sort of code. Of course, there is something that where you actually need to write some code, and this is something called manage configurations. This is what we're gonna go a bit more into today. Sorry. So the idea is that an IT admin would end up seeing some UI like this in the EMM console where they can configure certain values. So what are actually managed configurations, right? The process would go something like this. So you as an app developer, you would require something like a server URL to be configured for your specific application, right? The organization set up your solution on premise or somewhere in a private cloud. You need to customize this URL. So instead of building a separate version of your application, a separate fork, there is another option. That option is to use manage configurations. So the way you do it is basically you define that you require this value, in my case, server URL, to be configured by the IT admin and delivered to your organization. You publish your application, and this is pretty much where the first part of the cycle ends. Then the EMM admin would import it into their system. The system would read the metadata in your application, figure out that there are keys that needs to be configured, right? The EMM admin then would provide values for those things. They will save and push those changes, and then at the end, you as an application developer, you need to write some code to actually read that value and then actually use these values in your application and do whatever you need. Yeah, similar on a bit of a bigger scale. This works for any key value pairs, not just not just single items. So there are plenty of options. And what is the idea behind this? The idea behind this and why you want to do this is that because you're empowering the IT admin, right? So imagine you are an organization which manages 50 or more apps. We have cases where organizations have even hundreds of applications. And imagine if you want to configure those applications so each of them have a separate console where an admin needs to go into and tweak some things like the UI, the look, or whatever it might be, and how difficult a process that becomes for an IT admin. So the idea behind this is to actually optimize the user experience for the admin, make the whole process much simpler. Less of a communication is needed because everything is right there. Everything should be explained and easy to access and configure. So the question is what can actually be configured right now. So any combination of key value pairs you can think of, you can configure and send them back. So you can request them, and the IT admin can configure values for them and send them back to your application. Plus, this is quite an interesting thing that you can actually send some dynamic properties or properties based on the device. Things that even as developers right now we cannot even read, like the Wi-Fi MAC address, for example, is a property which is not available after Android 6.0. So using something like this, you can actually get these values back to your application. So there are some values that you can actually get which you typically would not be able to use in your application. Some device values, again, some user values. This becomes pretty important in identifying the user. So you can deliver things like the domain name of the organization, values from the certificates, things like the user's first, last name, email address. You can even deliver something like their passwords, if the admin actually configures them and decides that they want to send them to you. So it's a pretty powerful thing. Of course, you can also configure custom attributes. So a lot of these organizations would have in the background some sort of a system that would be Active Directory, some sort of identity provider, which actually stores additional values for each user, so you can actually map them and just get them to your devices as well. So less input for the user in your application that is needed. So what, in my line of work, in my experience, what we typically run into scenarios, and these are very common use cases that applications do and implement, is basically easing out the login. So imagine that your application, the best user experience you can get within an organization is actually providing the user with a seamless login. Like you deploy the application, the user installs the application, and then they need to enter either the least amount of data or nothing at all, right? So being able to deliver something like the username here is a really powerful feature. I talked about the server endpoints and things like that. And then I would mention that a huge use case and a very important thing is to actually deliver things that the admin can control in terms of security. That means that a lot of them don't want to send analytics to you maybe and things like that. So as soon as you provide those options, like just checkboxes to disable certain data analytics, certain maybe crash logging even, and a bunch of various features, maybe disable certain things for certain users, that already, you're basically becoming a favorite to the IT admin, right? So with every good, there is something bad as well, right? What are the issues and common kind of pitfalls and drawbacks of using these managed configurations? Well, the first thing that really comes to mind and a lot of people have issues with is the testing part. So in order to test your integration, you have to have an EMM instance. You have to publish your application through Google Play Managed Store, which you can also do privately and through the beta channels. That's not a problem. But still, you have to kind of get some expertise in the EMM area and be able to go through this process and test your integration. We offer some help with that, so like free test instances for developers and things like that. So if you ever need anything, that can also be simplified quite a lot. This only works with Android Enterprise, so you cannot deliver configurations if your device is not enrolled in an EMM and it's not part of Android Enterprise. We see that Android Enterprise is growing quite a lot, but it still are certain cases and certain organizations which are not using it. There are some restrictions on the APIs, and again, only primitive values can be delivered, but some of those things can be worked around. Basically, what you want to ensure before you try to do this is to know your audience. Basically, talk to the organization, figure out what their device fleet is. Are they using Android Enterprise or not, right? You need to figure all these things out before you actually invest the time, and this would prove to be very helpful further along the path. So let's talk briefly about this is quite a simple process. I'm sure everyone will get it. It's basically how to actually do the implementation of Android managed configuration. So what you start with is adding this to your Android manifest. You basically define that you're going to request manage configurations. This is a part of an API which is called app restrictions. It's been renamed to manage configurations quite recently, so you can find references, more reference to app restrictions than to manage configurations. We're looking through the documentation. So the next step would be to define this XML resource, and this would be kind of the template of how you would build this up. A list of restrictions. Each restriction typically would have a couple of required parameters and a couple of optional ones, and they would change based on what the type of the restriction is. Just going briefly over the actual restrictions and how they look like in the EMM. So you can have like a Boolean field. Then you can have enter any type of a string value. This is how typically you would indicate that you want to provide the dynamic parameters. So the $sign and the brackets username email address would actually send the actual user's email address as a value in this attribute. Things like a number input, so those would also be validated on the server, on the admin side. You would be able to do like drop downs. Here, there are some differences in what's required, so entries and entry values need to be specified, as well as multi-select, so you can provide things that option to choose between multiple stuff. There is a field type called hidden, which I've never seen used so far. I'm not sure what's the use of it, so if you don't really have a clear idea how to use it, just stay away, I would say. For now, let's see what the Android guys come up with in the future. So this is one of the kind of more important things, and this has been added a bit later, so API level 23. This is the ability to specify arrays of key and values. So the configuration would look something like this, and then you end up, the IT admin would end up seeing something like this. So imagine adding multiple values and then like a dynamic list of attributes that you can configure, right? The way you read the configured values would be something like this. So I would say this is pretty much all the code you will ever need. So it's quite a simple thing to do, right? So just like maybe 10 lines of code in total to just get an integration up and running. You go through something called a restrictions manager. So there is a part here which, and it's a typical bundle for all the Android developers here. You just get the bundle back and then you read keys and values from that bundle, and that's pretty much it. That's everything you need to do. You need to be careful about providing default values and things that are not configured, so you need to take care of these cases, like really trying to always have a value to return back so it can be used in the application. You can actually register a change receiver as well, so you can monitor for any changes the admin does. In my experience, this very rarely happens, even though everyone says it's possible, and it's more of like a configure and forget kind of a scenario, or the admin just modifies things maybe once in a month or something like that. And I would just typically recommend this for apps that are running for long periods of time, like kiosk applications, apps that run 24/7, right? In those cases, you really want to be able to monitor for these changes. For everything else, I would say don't complicate your code base and just stick to the basics. This is how it would look. So you have to register this in code, and this is the intent filter you have to use. Apart from that, it's all standard native Android APIs for registering and unregistering a broadcast receiver. You also need to, I suggest that you handle also these cases, like what happens if your app is installed on an unmanaged device. So you want to check if a managed configuration is available, and you want to actually check if the configuration is actually delivered and configured properly in cases of a managed application. So how do you actually, let's talk about, so this becomes a bit less about the technical stuff and more about getting an overview of how this whole process works through the console and how you end up deploying such a configuration. So you start by enabling Android Enterprise. So this is like, I'm showing how this is in Mobile Iron, but I'm trying to keep it as general as possible because every MM would have a very similar process to this. So you start by an action called authorize Google. So there is a recommended method to connecting Android Enterprise to an EMM system. And it's just a matter of having any type of a Google account, so you don't need to have a G Suite or anything like that. Any type of a Google account, preferably something owned by the company, would be used here. So you go through this small process of setting up the name, setting up some contact details, and that's it. So basically you click complete and you get back something called a Google Enterprise ID, which is a short identifier for your organization. And remember this, so this is going to be used by you as developers a bit later on. So another suggestion that I have, if you are going to test your integration with this, is try to use something called a work profile. So what this enables you to see is all the corner cases that might end up when trying to deploy your application in the enterprise. So this, what this does is splits your device into two separate containers, a private part and a work part, right? Any communication between those two parts is restricted, so you might run into issues doing that. Trying to call things with intents, like trying to communicate with other applications, might start failing. So be sure to actually test those things if you're getting your application ready for the enterprise. And this is a convenient way to do that. So what we want to go back to this kind of a workflow, right? So we want to avoid, we want to separate what we do as developers and what IT admins are doing. So our process is pretty much the same as we do any normal deployments on Google Play. We add our application listing, and the only difference pretty much is here in the pricing and distribution segment, where you can tick a box called Manage Google Play, which opens something like this. Here you can also check another checkbox to actually privately target certain organizations. You can add those by this identifier that I mentioned. So that's a huge, a really important thing, because a lot of organizations don't want their applications to be publicly available on the App Store, especially when doing in-house applications and things like that. So you have to be aware you can use Google Play, but there is still an option to actually privately distribute your applications. So the way you add an organization, you specify the organization ID, which we saw a bit earlier, right? And basically hit the release button as you would do for any normal application. You have to wait a while, like as with any other app you release on the App Store. You have to wait a while until this actually becomes released and it's available for the admin. And this is where your process as a developer stops, right? This is all you want to be doing. What happens on the other side is that the admin can see something like this. This is the URL they need to visit. I think as soon as you share the application, this is approved by default. I'm not sure. But what ends up happening in the EMM admin, the application that you just shared with the organization will show up something like this. So this is my sample. It will show up automatically. The IT admin would be able to see it. And then would actually be able to go into the details of this application. And there is a section, so I wasn't trying to show all the details about this, but again, this will be different based on the EMM you're using, but you end up getting to a screen and creating a configuration that would look something like this, where all the options that you can, which you can configure would get listed, right? The IT admin would be able to configure those values, click Save, and all these values would then be pushed back to the device, and they'll be available for usage. So typically there is kind of a interval between when the admins click Save and when these values actually get delivered to the application itself. It's typically not that long, and in new installations, like new employees installing your application, this is pretty much an immediate process. So you can make sure, you can pretty much be sure that these values will be there right at the beginning. So that was pretty much it. That is all I had. You can find links, so I created a sample. There is one sample from Google as well, where you can see the actual implementations. And for any questions that you might have, you want to do a deeper integration in an EMM system, you are considering actually going deeper into the enterprise segment, just you can reach out anytime. That's part of my job, to talk with people that want to do this sort of integrations, and we are very interested in growing our ecosystem and just having more and more people that actually optimize their applications for the enterprise. So thank you.
Darko, thank you. Thank you very much, Darko.